We're going to start by looking briefly at how communication happens, and we'll start with humans. Do we need words to communicate? Not really, right? Gestures, sounds, intonation, facial expressions, body language, there's a lot we use. The simplest example I can think of is a smile. It means pretty much the same thing in most parts of the world, except apparently New York City. I don't know. But otherwise, no matter what culture we come from, where we are, what mood we're in, we smile. And there's a lot we can glean from looking at a smile in terms of the person's intent, how our interaction is going to go with them, or again, quite universal, pretty much tells us the same thing no matter where we use it. Now here's the interesting bit. This versus this. How different are they? But technically very similar signals. Hand up, palm facing you, hand right next to the face, movement of the wrist, but almost polar opposite meaning. And that's interesting that not only are we able to communicate, but we're also able to communicate a lot of nuance. And that's pretty impressive. I mean, we did manage to travel to other parts of the world that didn't speak the same language before Google Translate, didn't we? And for those of us in India, we did manage to travel to other parts of India with no common language and managed to communicate and get by. And that's really interesting that for such a verbal species where words dominate a lot of our communication, we still have a very wide repertoire of what we're able to say without words, and quite universally too. So now when we look at animals, that is the world of non-verbal communication. I'm not saying not vocal, non-verbal communication. So I'd like to ask you to think of a few examples, not just with dogs, animal kingdom in general, all non-human animals. What are some of the examples that you can think of how animals communicate? Think about it, write it down, and let's discuss it in the next video. Animals have different ways to communicate. The first thing that comes to mind is probably sounds. Chirps, roars, hisses. But there are many other ways they communicate. Body language, wagging of a tail, facial expressions, a snarl, different waves of different wavelengths like ultrasound, think of bats, big mammals in the ocean, pheromones, body appendages, the feathers of a peacock, dance. Bees communicate through dance. Bee communication is actually quite fascinating. Until recently, it was believed that only human beings are capable of communicating about something in the abstract, meaning something that's not right here, right now. So spatially or temporally abstract. Bees, however, are able to communicate about flowers at a distance. So at least spatially abstract things, they are able to communicate through dances. And when we figured this out, we realized that the barrier between human and animal communication was breaking down. And we realized that the difference is not one of kind, but of degree, as we have famously heard. So animals have very many different ways to communicate. This is a vast topic and we're still beginning to uncover it. Some of them we do not even recognize as part of a signaling system. And so we will not be able to get into the nuance of all of that discussion here. We will whittle the whole thing down and let's talk about canids, and let's start with wolves. Wolves are pack predators. And that means they go out and function as a team to procure food. Now, hunting is a very dynamic activity. The prey is not exactly going to be playing into the hands of the predators. The prey is doing everything in its ability to throw this pack of predators off. And the wolves can't exactly rely on a plan that was part of their DNA or something they pre-planned. They have to change their plan dynamically on the fly, communicate with each other, you to the right, me to the left. For any of you who have played team sports or have been involved with it, you would appreciate the value of rapid, nuanced communication on the field for a team to work beautifully. And wolves are known to have a wide repertoire of facial expressions and body language signals. What about dogs? Do they have that too? How is dog communication similar or different to wolf communication? Like wolves, dogs too communicate with quite a wide repertoire of facial expressions and body language signals. They also vocalize, and what's interesting is that their vocalization repertoire is actually much bigger than that of wolves. If you want to know more about this, you can look up this book called Barking: The Sound of a Language by Turi Drugas. Now, why do you think dogs have a wider vocal repertoire, more vocalizations than wolves? Want to take a guess? So it is believed that it's because of us. We are such a verbal species, not exactly a very subtle, nuanced species. We like to be spoken to, we're loud, and the belief is that they vocalize to get our attention because of how closely they exist with us. But when it comes to facial expression and body language signals, their repertoire is much wider, and interestingly, we do understand several of this without needing any prior training of any kind. So I'd like you to go ahead and think about what some of this communication, examples of some of this type of communication that does not require us to train them, that they seem to know how to do automatically, that we seem to understand. I already gave you one hint of dogs using their eyes to beg. So can you think of more of that kind? So were you able to think about a few examples of how dogs and humans communicate? I'd like to give you an example, and I really love this one. So my old house, there used to be a bakery right outside my house. And around 4 o'clock, a bunch of cab drivers would turn up there to get a cup of tea and a smoke. And invariably, what happens at this time, and if you've been in India, this is, you know exactly what's going to happen next. When I usually conduct class, my students start smiling at this point because they know how this is going to play out and what's the next part of the story. It is such a familiar sight across India. So invariably, around a few minutes after 4 o'clock, there's a dog that turns up there. And what does this dog do? He's going to walk around the group, looking at everyone standing there, carefully picking out one person. And that's not an arbitrary pick. He's going to pick out the one person who is unlikely to shoo him away and likely to actually do something for him. Go up to this one person, look at him and say, "Hi, can you buy me biscuits?" And what's incredible is this man of somewhat limited means is actually going to go ahead and buy a pack of biscuits for this street dog or streetie, as we like to call them. And what's even more fun to watch is the guy at the bakery who's selling the stuff there is going to turn around and say, "Oh, that dog doesn't like this biscuit. This is what you should buy." And this man will oblige and spend a little extra to get the other kind of stuff. And I find this absolutely fascinating that I used to watch this interaction a lot. And one day I decided to go ahead and talk to one of these guys. I went to him and I said, "So you have a dog?" And he looks at me and he says, "I'm an Uber driver. I live in my cab." "Okay, so you must be a dog lover, right?" And that didn't make sense to him. It's not a concept that's very familiar in India. It's more of a new age urban concept kind of a thing. So he looked at me with not really comprehending what I was asking him. So then I said, "Okay, why did you buy the dog biscuits?" And the man said, "The dog asked." I asked him, "How did you know that the dog asked?" That's around the time at which he realized he decided that I was a crazy person and just decided to ignore me. But my point is, this is quite a bit of communication actually, for two species to be able to say this and understand each other. That's actually quite a bit. And if you talk to people who take care of streeties in Bangalore, we call them streetie guardians or streetie feeders, they'll tell you some incredible things. Dogs not only are able to ask for provisions like food, but also for medical care. Not only for themselves, but they are able to ask for their puppies, They will say, come, you need to help my puppies, or come, you need to help my friend. And there's also another fascinating communication that they do, which we don't fully understand yet, is when they're near their end of their lives, they seem to turn up at the house of the person who's been caring most for them. So they've disappeared for a while, and then they turn up, they spend a few hours, and then they go away and they die, and they're found a little later. And what do they come to say? What was that last visit all about? We haven't fully understood it yet, but it really poses a lot of interesting questions. And the thing I told you about the dog picking the right person, that's not arbitrary either. There are actually studies that show us that dogs are able to distinguish between fair and unfair humans based on how humans treat each other. And they have a preference towards fair humans. They're able to distinguish between helpful and unhelpful human beings, and you know what they prefer. And this one has been done on street dogs too. So I joke that they're able to look into our soul and they judge us. And all of this is absolutely fascinating, that they're able to do so much of it without any training of any kind. These are not ex-pet dogs. These are dogs that were born on the streets. They've been brought up by other dogs, and this is the communication repertoire that they have. So how do they do this? For this, to answer this, we need to take a look at the natural history of dogs. So let's do that, and let's start that by asking a simple question. When did dogs become dogs? So, when did dogs become dogs? There are many ways to arrive at this answer, fossil evidence being the most conservative one. And there have been fossils found that put them back at 35 to 38,000 years old. There are other ways to determine this, and they provide older still numbers. The experts are still debating on this, so the jury is still out, but it's a lot of years, and it has been a lot of time for us to develop a language, communication between our species, because there have been dogs living besides us. So let me give you an example. This is the story that I absolutely love of fossil evidence, about 25,000-year-old fossil evidence found in caves in France of a boy and a dog walking next to each other in the cave, where there were paintings on the wall that were about 10,000 years old. Now here are the interesting things. The boy was walking, not running. The dog was not chasing him, but walking next to him. They even had a torch, and they seem to have stopped to refill fuel into the torch. So that's been captured as well. And it's interesting that if adults of his settlement or whatever allowed him to be with this animal, that means there was a trusted relationship there. So basically, it's probably a story of a boy and his friend, a dog, in a prehistoric museum. And it gives me goosebumps, because I can almost picture the exact same thing happening in a village in India. A boy and a free-ranging community dog, maybe in some ruins of some kind, sketching out their name there. And what gives me the goosebumps is the realization that what I see in the villages of India is a legacy of this relationship that has been 25,000 years old, if not older still. A legacy of a relationship between two species that are codependent on each other and clearly need a foundation of communication if it has had to last this long. There's another aspect to consider, the diet of dogs. Now, a lot of people think dogs, like their wolf counterparts, are predators. But that's not really true. That's not what ethological studies actually show us. We know that about 70 to 80% of the dogs in the world are free-ranging dogs. And with the exception of just a few of them, maybe the ones like in Galapagos Island, where there isn't that much human habitation, the rest of them are the ones that live on the outskirts, where they're persecuted and they live on the outskirts of human habitation. The rest of them who live integrated with humans They are primarily scavengers and preferential beggars. And what's also interesting is in places where they are not persecuted, these, like for example in India, the Constitution of India actually protects them. So in places like this, given a choice, given free will, despite the fact that humans are responsible for a large part of their mortality, they choose to live amongst us, depend on us, collaborate with us, and are still part of a codependent relationship. And that needs communication. So this is going to be the focus of our class. This type of communication that has already existed between two species that have had a codependent relationship for tens of thousands of years, if not more. Now, before we proceed, I do want to make a point here. I don't consider myself an expert on dogs. Dogs are experts on dogs. I will plant some ideas in your head, but eventually the source of truth is the dogs. I would like for you to go and observe them. At BHARCS, our motto is learning to learn from dogs, because really that's what we hope we can enable for everybody who's participating with us. So if you have access to free-ranging dogs, excellent. Go ahead and observe them. If not, maybe videos of free-ranging dogs, maybe dog parks. Find different opportunities to observe. Observe without preconceived notions, without prejudice and judgment, just with a childlike curiosity, and see where that takes you. So I'd like to give you a little bit of work before you do the next section, and I'm going to encourage that you don't do this course back to back as a theoretical course. I'm going to encourage that you take regular breaks and go observe, see what you can see, and then come back and compare notes. It's meant to be practical and a lot of field work, or at least video analysis. So I'm going to ask you to observe dogs, and can you spot what may be signals, maybe part of a signaling system in them? What might they be trying to communicate about their internal state and about their priorities? Try and make a note of it and come back into the next section. In the next section, we'll get specific about some of these signals. We'll list them out. We'll watch some videos and try to determine the context in which they're being used and see if we can interpret them. What we are attempting to do here is somewhat understand a dog's language. And now, for those of us who have tried to learn a new language as an adult, we know that learning a new language is not as simple as word-to-word translations. Sometimes words just don't translate between languages. Concepts don't translate. For example, the Inuit are supposed to have 15 different words for snow, something that is absolutely not translatable in the subtropical part of the world, South India. Even if you did manage to translate it, concepts that we would not probably be able to understand, especially those of us who have not been in snow or never seen it. These words make sense to the people who live in that context. Their language supports their reality and their priorities and helps them express their perspective. Now, when we talk about two different species, this problem gets even more compounded. Animal senses are different from ours. What they perceive is different from what we perceive. Their priorities, their social decorum based on their social structure, what they value and they need to communicate to each other. These are things we may fully never understand. That's not going to stop us from trying to do what we're going to do now, but we're going to bear that in mind and carry on with that humility. So, how are we going to approach this? Again, for those of us who have probably learned a new language as an adult, we have probably experienced that the best way to do it is to immerse ourselves in the context and just allow the meaning to somewhat pop out at us. I remember when I was spent some time in Japan, I learned a lot more Japanese phrases by watching television ads, listening to radio ads, phrases that I would hear in the PA system in the railway station and on the train, and I learned far more that way than in my orientation class. So we're going to try and use a similar approach here as well. So before we proceed, I'd like to give you a little bit of an exercise to kind of get those muscles working. I'd like for you to think of some everyday object, maybe a mattress or shoes or toothpaste, and search for advertisements in another language. Pick a language and search for ads in another language for this particular product. If you can find more than one advertisement and something with some visuals as well, and just listen to them repeatedly and see if intuitively the meaning of something just pops out at you. You don't need to be able to translate it. You need to intuitively develop a feel for the meaning. For example, one of the ads that I used to watch a lot in Japan was for sushi, and the phrase oishi was being used a lot there. Now, I don't need to know exactly what it means. All I know is in the context of eating something, saying oishi in some way expresses my appreciation of that experience. So that's what I mean when I say let the meaning just pop out at you and see if you can identify something. Dogs have several different ways in which they communicate, barking being one of them. And there are several different kinds of barks. Interestingly, studies do show that we are able to distinguish these different kinds of barks. Now let's just park the studies aside and let's get into this discussion where I'd like for you to experience this for yourself. So the first few I want to bring up is fear barking and excitement barking. Now, fear barking is kind of unmissable. Think of an animal that you hear screaming at a distance, maybe because she's being hurt or she's terrified. That's an unmissable bark, and it's distinctly different from the bark that you hear your dog giving out maybe when she's excited that she's going to get in the car and go someplace fun. One of my classmates mentioned that fear barking is one of those sounds when animals express fear, it's that unmissable sound that you can feel in your gut. And I've heard a lot of my students say when they hear this sound, they can't help but react to it. And when they run out because they hear a streetie making the sound, sure enough, the streetie seems to be in trouble and needs rescuing. It's a sound that's meant to draw attention, and we're wired to feel something. And clearly, it sounds nothing like the excitement that's heard in the voice of a dog where a guest has walked in or a dog that is playing. So that's fear barking and excitement barking. Then there is guard barking, which again is quite distinct in how the dog mixes barks along with growls and a lot of hackles raised and things like that. And there's frustration barking. Again, it's there's a distinct monotonous bark with monotonous movement associated with it, often seen in dogs that are confined for extended periods of time, maybe tethered or in cages or crates, and you can see frustration barking. And then there are two more interesting ones. One is connection seeking barking and alert barking that we see in more regular situations in our households. Connection by itself is what we call an inelastic need in social animals. What that means is it's not a luxury, it's required for survival. And social beings experience, when they do not have this connection, they experience what is called social pain or emotional pain. And studies do show us that in the brain, it is experienced almost identically to physical pain, sometimes even worse than it, to the point where social beings could even willingly choose to experience physical pain so as to avoid or alleviate social pain. And dogs are hypersocial animals. So if their connection need is not met, they may ask for it. And if the way they're asking isn't getting them what they want, they may start escalating. And that's where we're likely to see connection seeking barking. And there's something interesting that we may even observe. These dogs may choose to engage in this behavior even if they're being punished or reprimanded for it, or they're annoying their human beings. They may continue to engage in this. And a way to understand this is, so interestingly, studies also show with human beings that social pain is so intense that when they compared human beings that experienced social isolation with those that experienced a bit of social isolation along with abuse, the pain experienced by those who were in complete social isolation was a lot more than the ones that were being a little abused. The abuse, the negative connection that comes from there was still compensating for the complete lack of connection. And that's really an extreme example, but it kind of can start explaining why dogs may be exhibiting this behavior. The need for that connection is really that high, and if we continue to ignore them, and they may just choose to take that negative connection that we give them, and if we ignore them, it may start escalating into different kinds of behaviors, even leading to self-harm and things like that, because this need is so high. So that's connection seeking barking, and the next one is alert barking. Now, when we think about the first role that dogs had in our lives, alerting is most likely the one that played a big role. Now, dogs, our relationship with them predates domestication. So the belief is that dogs co-evolved with human beings. In fact, there's even a theory that suggests that Homo sapiens survived compared to other, like Neanderthal man. Homo sapiens survived because we had dog with us. I don't know how true that is, but that's interesting. And so I'd like to, so how did this whole thing happen? How did we come to live with each other like this? How did we come to have this symbiotic relationship? So I'd like to picture this in a fun little way, and I'll share that with you. Academics may not like it that much, but hey, I like thinking through things through stories. So I can almost picture a dog-like animal walking up to a human-like human and saying, okay, so it looks like you and I have common enemies in the forest. Now you, with all your tools and thingies, are pretty good at dealing with them, way better than I am. But you're kind of terrible at knowing when those animals are coming. So here's the deal. Why don't I alert you, because I'm pretty good at seeing this at a distance, or hearing this or smelling this at a distance. So why don't I detect it for you? I lie right out here outside of your house, and I'll let you know when there is trouble, and then you take care of the problem. After that, it's yours. I'm going to kind of run away to the background. And while we're at it, why don't you put out a little bed and some food for me? And in return, what I'll do is I'll make these big eyes, floppy ears, soft coat, and I'll act a little like a fool so that you're in love with me. And that's called neoteny, and dogs are known to act like juveniles of other animals. They are known to look and act like juvenile canids, juvenile wolves. They play well into their adulthood, something that very few species do. So, and all of that is known to be possibly because we like it. So that little animal is probably saying, okay, so don't kick me out like you kick all the other animals out and like you kill all the other animals. Don't do that with me, because I'm going to be cute and I'm going to make you feel good and generate all the wonderful hormone, and let me stay here. Can we strike that deal? So obviously don't take any of this literally. It's just a story that I made up. But to paint a picture here, and that codependent relationship that's probably evolved because of alerting being the first function that we found valuable. And we see that even to this day. So even though we have different kinds of dogs and breeds that we have created, the fundamental thing of being an alerter is still there in many dogs. And some breeds are actually specifically bred for it even to this day, the Lhasa Apso, for example. So many of our dogs are likely to be alerters. And you can see alert barking as something that is directed at something on the outside. There doesn't seem to be too much intent to do much about it. So it isn't meant to be guarding or scaring that monster that the dog is probably perceiving. There's no intent there other than to just alert and bring down the roof. Now, our local dogs, Indies that we call here in India, they are strong alerters. It's a very strong trait still in them. I make fun that my dog Chiru, she's an alerter. I make fun that she will bring down the roof if anybody enters our pin code. And a lot of people make fun that Indies incite trouble, that they kind of will woof, 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 wake up everybody, get everybody riled up, and then run off to the back and hide at the back, and they don't really do anything about it. But they're not inciting troubles, they're not troublemakers. This is classic alerting behavior, which is woof woof, I need to wake everybody up, but that is where my job ends. That was my job, to let you all know that there is trouble, that you need to do something about it, and my job is done. Sadly though, if we do not respond to them the right way, we do not show them that we can take care of whatever that they are worried about, then they may start escalating it, and we may start seeing different kinds of behaviors, including guard barking and things like that. And then there are a few other kinds of vocalizations. There are a few breed specific barks. There are vocalizations like whining, whimpering, howling, some of which we understand, like whimpering, some of which we don't really understand, like howling. It's so mysterious to us. And my students who have been trying to study this, we've identified that howling is not just one single vocalization. There seems to be different kinds of howls, like different kinds of barks. But we still need to develop a better understanding of this. And then there are a whole host of them, like singing. I've heard dogs sing along with the ambulance and things like that, gurgling and all kinds of stuff. And then there is growling. This falls under the category of what we call distance creating signal, and there are a few others, and we will discuss that in the next video. But before we do, I would like for you to think about whether you can think of distance creating signals in other animals, like hissing, hackles raised. What are the things you can picture? What are the things you have seen? And what do you think is the purpose it serves the animal? What are these distance creating signals meant for? If you want to learn more about barks, I suggest you pick up the book Barking the Sound of a Language by Turid Ruges, where she talks about different sound signatures and movement signatures that help us classify the bark and what to do in each situation. Now we're going to look at the other signals, and remember I spoke to you about looking the context in which the signals are used and try to understand them. So we will break up the context into two here, distance creating signals and calming signals. We'll talk about distance creating signals to start with. So distance creating signals are used in a context where the animal is asking for space to create distance. So if we were to use game theory language, these signals are meant for partial conflict of interest signaling. The partial bit is interesting. If you think of a situation where, let's say that two animals are having conflict of interest over a shared resource. So sure, there is conflict of interest there, but there is also a certain common interest, which is they would like to resolve this without actually resorting to true violence. If you think of street dogs, streeties, or other free-ranging animals, if they actually got into a fight, regardless of who won or lost, both are likely to sustain injuries, scratches and bites, and these can get infected or maggot infested, and it can even be fatal, or they could lose a limb or lose opportunity to look for food for several days, dropping their health. So when we talk about survival of the fittest, it's not necessarily the one that can fight the most. Often it can be the one who is very, very good at resolving issues without resorting to true violence. So that's really what these signals are meant for, is to ask for space, to ask for distance, and to try and resolve things without actually having conflict. Many animals do have such signals. Cats that hiss and curl up, snakes that lift their hood and hiss, the lizards, the frill neck lizards that flare out their frills. So there are many examples. Dogs have it too. Growls, snarling, showing of the teeth, lunging, air snapping, and they're all meant to ask for space. And if we don't give them that space, if we continue to push them, then it may lead to a bite. So they're trying to avoid the bite, but they are in a situation where they feel like they may have to. And so they're trying to use all these signals to try and prevent it from going into the bite. Now, what I find interesting is most of us, when we see such signals in other animals, we seem to know exactly what we need to do. So if a snake picks up his hood, we know we need to back off, create distance. Even if we are in a situation where we are trying to rescue that snake, we know that the snake is feeling pushed, that the snake is very close to the edge, and so we have to be extremely careful. So it's okay, don't hurt me, I'm just trying to help you. Even with street dogs, if a street dog growls, we know what we need to do. All right, I am backing off. And again, even if you're trying to rescue them, we know what we need to do, how to approach it. Interestingly, with our pet dogs, we seem to change the rules. If a dog growls at us, we do not increase distance, we reduce distance and say, you are growling at me. Somehow it becomes personal. Somehow we take offense at it. I've had a few clients who've kind of called me and said, I need help. My dog, when he growls at me, if I scold him, he bites. Yes, he has actually been telling you that. He has been telling you, for whatever reason, I'm feeling pushed, I'm feeling cornered, I'm feeling threatened, I need space. And if you don't, I might have to take the next step, which I don't want to. But instead of giving space, you have closed space, and that has escalated. And that communication was right there. Your dog said what the intent was. When we see a growl, the only safe thing to do, when we see distance creating signals, the only safe thing to do for us is to create that distance. You could come back later, seek professional help to figure out why your dog is feeling so threatened so frequently maybe. But at that time, the only safe thing to do is to create distance. If your dog is growling at somebody else, maybe you can ask them to go away. Maybe you can take your dog away. Maybe you can go behind a barrier so that there's a barrier between your dog and whatever is making him feel threatened. If your dog is growling at you, maybe you can put a barrier or just back off a little bit, avert gaze and just back off a little bit. Anything that can create space so that the dog can start relaxing a bit more. It's also important not to punish the behavior or even try to modify it, because these are important signals that are part of their communication. And without that, we will not know the state of the mind that the dog is in. And if the dog is feeling pushed, he might have lost his repertoire to communicate that with you, which means that the bite is going to come out of the blue without a warning. So it's absolutely important to understand that this is normal part of a dog's ethogram or a dog's behavior collection. It is not meant to offend us. It's meant to communicate that they are experiencing something. They're not trying to do something to us. They're expressing what they are experiencing, and that is something uncomfortable, that is something unpleasant. So often what they need is they need our help to figure out how to deal with it, not for us to personalize it and get angry with them. We really can't be misinterpreting the signal. It's far too dangerous. We're going to start by looking at a video of Nishi and Whitey. No prizes for guessing who is Whitey here. Whitey is the white dog and Nishi is the dark boxer. Whitey is a free-ranging community dog, and she's not very, she's a bit unwell in this video. You can see that she's not in great shape. So she does not want to be approached by any dog. So she does give a lot of distance creating signals. If you turn up the volume, you can hear her growl and you can see her showing her teeth. Nishi walks in, she gives a few signals too. She wants to befriend Whitey. She tries a little bit, but once it doesn't work, she gives up and walks away. What I would like for you to do when you watch this is try to make a note of how many signals that you saw. Make a note of the signals that you feel Nishi is giving as well. We will discuss that in the next section. We'll come back to this video once more. But distance creating signals given by Whitey is something you should be able to recognize. And also make a note of how long the entire interaction lasted. Let's have a look at the video. So there's Nishi walking in. Now just a hint here, Nishi is blind in one eye. I'd like for you to see if you can recognize how that impacts her communication and observe the interaction between both of them. Feel free to put my audio on mute and just observe the dogs. Okay. And that's it. All right. Now, keep in mind that these are conflict of interest signals, and these are a little bit more expensive than regular signals. They're not subtle. They are bigger, they take more energy, and sometimes they have other costs associated with it too. Whitey did not use very big conflict of interest signals, but many animals do, so do dogs. Animals in general live their life in a way where they minimize their energy expenditure. So then why would they take on this extra cost? Because usually there's something bigger at stake. There's something that they're feeling insecure about, something that they value that they are nervous they're going to lose. What is that they're valuing? Is it their life? Is it their well-being? Are they important resources? Using empathy can help us arrive at the answer often. Now, a note on using empathy. There are certain professionals who would frown upon the idea of using empathy in the case of understanding animals, and I understand where they come from. Yes, there are risks to it, there are downsides to using empathy, we can get carried away a little bit, but the downside of not using empathy is a much bigger risk to animal welfare, in my opinion, and can lead us to engage in behaviors that can severely hurt animals in a very unjustifiable way and cause unjustifiable amount of cruelty on them, and it has in the past in history. And we are also beginning to see that there is a growing voice among canine ethologists as well as professionals who work with animals who call out for using empathy when dealing with animals. So that's the approach I would like to use, while keeping in mind that there are downsides to it. We could get carried away a little bit, so we'll keep that in mind and we'll try to see where we can support our arguments with science where possible, but our general approach is going to be one of using empathy. Now, before we head out of this section, I'd like for you to take a short break because we've come to the end of this section, and in the next section we'll talk about calming signals. I'd like for you to take a short break right now and look for opportunities to observe animals and see if you can see distance creating signals. It could be videos, it could be live dogs. If you're going to use videos, try to mute the human being and factor out the human opinion on this and just observe the animals. What is it telling you about their internal state? What is it that they might be feeling insecure or threatened about? What is it that they might feel they're likely to lose? Where is it coming from? Also, how are other animals of their own species or other species responding to these signals? Usually, the best response is within the same species. What are the rules of the signaling game? And with animals that we take into our homes and ask them to live with us, how do we react to these signals? Are we understanding and respecting the rules of the signaling game? Are we violating it? Would that confuse the animals? Would this be considered a breakdown of communication? And could this breakdown of communication lead to stress, both in them and in us? This is something I'd like for you to mull about, watch a few videos, think about this, and I'll see you in the next section.